They came like a whisper on the wind, horsemen from the edge of the world, moving faster than rumor, striking harder than storm. From the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the golden gates of Baghdad, they changed the shape of the world with bowstring, fire, and vision. Their names sent tremors through kingdoms, their shadow fell across continents, and their legacy, though born in blood, birthed a new age of connection, conquest, and culture. This is not just the story of an empire. This is the story of how one man, born into obscurity, defied fate and forged the largest land empire in human history. It is a tale of ambition without equal, of loyalty and betrayal, of cities razed and civilizations remade. This is the saga of the Mongols, brutal, brilliant, and unforgettable. So settle in, clear your mind, and let the winds of history carry you eastward, into the heart of the steppe, into the rise of the great Khan, and into the firestorm that changed the world forever. If you're fascinated by the rise and fall of great empires, by the raw force of history and the stories that shaped our modern world, then you've come to the right place. Make sure to like this video if you're enjoying the journey so far, it truly helps us reach more curious minds like yours. And if you want to join us on even more epic explorations through time and civilization, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, or even your favorite Mongol fact down in the comments below. Now, let's ride into the storm. The winds of the steppe, birth of a warrior. Long before the Mongol Empire thundered across the continents, before cities trembled at the sound of hooves on the horizon, there was only the wind. It howled across the endless steppes of Central Asia, carrying with it the dust of 1,000 forgotten tribes and the scent of wild horses galloping across a vast and unforgiving landscape. This was no land of cities and kings, but of clans and chaos. It was a world where survival was a matter of will, where nature ruled supreme, and where legends were carved not in stone but in the shifting soil of memory and song. Among the jagged hills and open plains of what is now northeastern Mongolia, sometime around the year 1162, a child was born into this brutal world. His name was Temujin, and though no one knew it then, his life would become the pivot on which world history would turn. His arrival came not with fanfare but amidst blood and uncertainty. His father, Yasugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a powerful lineage among the Mongol tribes but far from supreme. The Mongol world at the time was a fractured tapestry of tribal alliances and deadly rivalries, where loyalty could shift with the wind and the ambitions of men could lead to the annihilation of entire families. Temujin's birth itself was marked by an omen. According to the secret history of the Mongols, the oldest surviving Mongolian chronicle, he was born clutching a blood clot in his fist, a sign among the nomads that the child was destined to become a great warrior. Whether this account was historical or mythical, it reflected a deeper truth: Temujin was born into violence and would be shaped by its ruthless logic. As a young boy, Temujin was introduced early to the cruel politics of the steppe. His father, Yasugei, had once kidnapped his mother, Holon, from another tribe, a common practice in the lawless terrain of the Mongolian highlands. Though abducted, Holon became a loyal and respected mother, embodying the ferocious spirit that would later define her son. Together, they lived a nomadic existence, moving with the seasons, relying on their herds, and defending themselves against the perpetual threat of rival clans and roaming bandits. Tragedy struck when Temujin was just 9 years old. His father, while returning from arranging a marriage for the boy, was poisoned by the Tatars, a rival tribe with whom the Mongols had a tenuous relationship. With Yasugei's death, the fortunes of Temujin's family plummeted. The tribe that had once followed his father abandoned the family, leaving Holon and her children to survive alone in the wild. They were cast out, left to fend for themselves in the harsh wilderness, scouring the land for roots, berries, and small game. It was a moment of betrayal that would not be forgotten, and it planted in Temujin a hatred for disloyalty that would become one of the pillars of his leadership ethos. The years of exile hardened Temujin. He grew lean and watchful, a boy who learned to trust no one blindly. Hunger and cold were his teachers, and every hardship carved into him a strength of will that surpassed that of his peers. He came to understand the cruel balance of power in the steppe. Only those who commanded fear and inspired loyalty would survive. It was a bitter, unforgiving crucible, but it forged in him the qualities that would soon change the world. Even in his early years, Temujin displayed remarkable leadership. He gathered a small band of followers, other outcasts and loyal friends, including the now legendary Boworshu and Jelm, who would remain his comrades until the end of his life. Among them was also his blood brother, or Anda, Jamukha, a boy of noble birth and immense charisma. The bond between Temujin and Jamukha would begin in brotherhood and end in betrayal, a tragic arc that echoed the volatile nature of steppe politics. Temujin's adolescence was marked by near-constant struggle. He was captured and enslaved by a rival clan, the Taichi-Udi, who placed a wooden collar around his neck to break his spirit. Yet even in chains, Temujin refused to yield. He escaped with the help of a sympathetic jailer, cementing his reputation as someone favored by fate, or perhaps, someone too dangerous to remain bound. His legend began to grow. Whispers of his resilience spread through the nomadic tribes, and with each trial, Temujin's determination became more formidable. Marriage soon followed, an essential move in the strategy of any aspiring Mongol leader. Temujin married Borte, a woman of the Ongjarat tribe. This alliance would prove crucial in solidifying his early power. But tragedy struck again when Borte was kidnapped by the Merkits, a rival tribe that sought revenge for the way Temujin's father had once stolen Holon. In response, Temujin, with the help of his ally and future rival Jamukha and another powerful leader, Togrul of the Karite, led a daring raid to rescue her. Borte was saved, and from their union would come Joki, the first of Temujin's sons, though his parentage would remain a subject of political intrigue. These early trials, poverty, betrayal, slavery, and war, did not break Temujin. They honed him. He began to attract more followers, not through birthright, but by merit. This was revolutionary. On the steppes, loyalty had traditionally been to family, to clan, to blood. Temujin's vision was different. He promoted men for their ability and loyalty, not their lineage. In a society shackled by tradition, this was a radical idea. It gave him an edge his rivals could not match. By his early 20s, Temujin was no longer just a survivor. He was becoming a force. His reputation for leadership, fairness, and ferocity began to draw warriors to his cause. He had no grand title yet, no empire, no army of 10,000. But in the whispers of the grasslands, a new power was rising, one forged not from noble bloodlines, but from scars, steel, and sheer will. The wind of the steppe had begun to change. And at its center stood a man who would become the greatest conqueror the world had ever known. Exile and survival, the making of Temujin. If Chapter 1 was the tale of a boy cast into the fire, then Chapter 2 is the story of that fire shaping iron. As Temujin stepped from childhood into adolescence, his world was still one of exile, cold, hunger, and the ever-looming specter of death. But something within him refused to break. It was here, in the windswept solitude of the Mongolian wilderness, stripped of protection and privilege, that Temujin truly began to understand the fundamental truths of power and survival. The young Temujin, abandoned by his tribe and hunted by enemies, now found himself in a position that would annihilate most. His family was destitute. They lacked food, allies, and security. The very basics of life, warmth, sustenance, safety, were uncertain luxuries. Yet in this crucible, Temujin developed not just resilience, but a calculated understanding of human nature. He saw that loyalty was rare and often conditional. He witnessed how kin could betray, how trust could be sold, and how leadership must be earned, not inherited. One of the earliest indicators of his emerging ruthlessness came during a fateful clash with his half-brother, Begtur. As the eldest male in the family, Begtur tried to assert dominance over the remaining members after their father's death. According to Mongol customs, this was expected, but Temujin saw it as a direct threat to the fragile unity and survival of their small band. In a grim moment that would foreshadow his future decisiveness, Temujin killed Begtur. Though the act was harsh, it wasn't mindless savagery. It was a calculated move: eliminate the threat, stabilize the group, and maintain order. This early act of fratricide, recorded in the secret history of the Mongols, is often debated by historians. Some see it as cold-blooded, others interpret it as a grim necessity born from a brutal world. What's indisputable is that it marked a turning point. Temujin was not simply surviving, he was imposing structure, asserting control, and making decisions with long-term consequences in mind. In these years of wandering exile, his mother Holon played an instrumental role. A woman of tremendous strength and dignity, she managed to hold the family together with virtually no resources. She taught her children to respect the land, to hunt, to ride, and to rely on no one but themselves. Her fierce independence and moral clarity became bedrock principles for Temujin. While other warlords boasted noble lineages, Temujin's nobility would come not from ancestry, but from hardship, determination, and the loyalty he inspired. It was during this period that Temujin began to form what would become his inner circle, a cadre of loyal warriors who would follow him into hell if he commanded it. Among these were Boworshu and Jelm, men who pledged themselves to Temujin not out of obligation or clan ties, but from personal loyalty and shared hardship. These relationships were sealed not by blood but by acts of trust and sacrifice, and they laid the foundation for a new kind of brotherhood, one that would eventually redefine the concept of allegiance across the steppes. Temujin's genius lay in his ability to identify loyalty, reward merit, and punish betrayal, regardless of tribal affiliation or family history. This meritocratic instinct would later become a cornerstone of the Mongol Empire. At a time when most leaders clung to traditions of hereditary privilege, Temujin promoted people based on what they did, not who their fathers were. This wasn't idealism, it was strategy. By offering advancement to the talented and overlooked, he was able to build a cadre of fiercely loyal supporters who had everything to gain from his rise. But before he could rise, he had to survive, and to do that, he needed allies. This led to one of the most consequential relationships in his early life, his friendship and later rivalry with Jamukha. The two young men were Anda, a Mongol term denoting a deep bond of sworn brotherhood. They hunted together, fought together, and dreamed of uniting the Mongol tribes. But while their vision for the future initially seemed aligned, their methods and values would eventually diverge. Jamukha, born of a noble line, believed in the old ways, tribal aristocracy, lineage-based authority, and traditional power structures. Temujin, shaped by abandonment and betrayal, believed in loyalty over blood, talent over birthright. These opposing philosophies simmered beneath their brotherhood like a hidden fire, and in time, they would erupt in war. During his youth, Temujin also sought to secure his position through political marriage, a common tactic on the steppe. He married Borte, a woman of the Ongjarat tribe, thus forming a key alliance. Borte was more than just a political asset. By all accounts, she was intelligent, composed, and fiercely loyal. Her capture by the Merkits and Temujin's determined campaign to rescue her underscored her significance in his life. The mission to retrieve Borte was not just personal, it was political, and it showcased Temujin's ability to rally support when needed, even in his youth. To rescue her, Temujin turned to two key allies, his blood brother Jamukha, and Togrul, the powerful Khan of the Karite tribe, who had once been an ally of Yasugei, Temujin's father. With their help, Temujin mounted a successful raid, rescued Borte, and struck a decisive blow against the Merkits. This military success elevated his reputation and marked his re-entry into the broader stage of steppe politics. This episode also demonstrated something unique about Temujin's growing power: his ability to forge coalitions across tribal lines. Where other leaders relied solely on kinship and tradition, Temujin offered a vision of unity based on strength, loyalty, and common cause. This ability to unify disparate and often hostile groups would become his signature move, a strategy that would, in time, allow him to conquer the largest empire the world had ever seen. But that was still to come. For now, Temujin was a rising leader with few resources but immense potential. He was a survivor of betrayal and starvation, a boy hardened into a man by necessity. He had buried his brother, slain his enemies, rescued his wife, and won the loyalty of men who would follow him to the ends of the earth. He had made himself into more than just a warrior, he had become a leader, a symbol, and a storm-gathering force on the steppes. And still, the world underestimated him. The next chapter would mark the first major turning point in his transformation from a minor warlord to the unifier of the Mongol nation, a feat thought impossible for centuries. But Temujin was not a man of impossibilities. He was a man of inevitabilities. The time had come to challenge the old ways. To remake the steppe. To rise. Blood and brotherhood, forging the Mongol nation. By the time Temujin reached his mid-20s, he was no longer simply a survivor of hardship or a skilled raider. He had become something far rarer on the steppes of Central Asia, a visionary. While others fought to protect their ancestral privileges and tribal boundaries, Temujin dreamed of something greater, a unified Mongol nation, forged not through lineage but through loyalty, not through entitlement but through merit. But to build such a vision in a land dominated by fractious tribes, blood feuds, and ancient rivalries would require more than ambition. It would require war. The world Temujin sought to change had long been defined by disunity. The Mongol plateau was home to dozens of clans, each with its own customs, loyalties, and grudges. Leadership was based on aristocratic bloodlines, and power often changed hands through betrayal or force. No single Khan had ever successfully brought all the Mongol tribes under one banner for more than a fleeting moment. Yet Temujin believed it could be done, and more importantly, that it must be done. He understood that only unity would allow the Mongols to rise beyond their cycles of infighting and become a force to be reckoned with in the larger world. But before he could unite the tribes, Temujin had to challenge the existing Mongol aristocracy. And that meant confronting his once beloved blood brother, Jamukha. Their paths had diverged sharply. While Temujin built a following based on talent and loyalty, Jamukha remained rooted in the traditional power structures of the Mongol elite. Jamukha's forces were composed of noble-born warriors who looked down on Temujin's egalitarian approach. To them, Temujin was an upstart, clever, yes, but dangerous and destabilizing. The rivalry between Temujin and Jamukha came to a head in 1187 in what would become the first major test of Temujin's leadership, the Battle of Dalan Baljet. Temujin, supported by commoners, loyal warriors, and several smaller clans, fielded a smaller but highly disciplined army. Jamukha, backed by the traditional aristocracy and powerful noble families, outnumbered him nearly 2-1. The battle was fierce and decisive. Though Temujin's forces were agile and innovative, they were overwhelmed by Jamukha's superior numbers and crushed. In the aftermath, Jamukha executed 70 young captains from Temujin's army by boiling them alive, an act of brutality meant not only to punish, but to send a message to anyone who dared challenge the old order. This was not merely war, it was a ritualistic reminder of who held the sacred right to rule. Temujin, though defeated, was not destroyed. He escaped with his core followers and disappeared into the steppe. The loss, instead of breaking him, became a crucible of refinement. He studied the battle, its mistakes, and its implications. He realized that to win the next confrontation, he would need more than just warriors, he would need an entirely new system of command, discipline, and administration. In the years that followed, Temujin began laying the foundation for that system. He introduced decimal organization to his army, dividing his forces into units of tens, arban, hundreds, zun, thousands, mingan, and 10,000s, tumun. This structure made command more efficient and battle formations more flexible. But more than that, it erased tribal identities. Men from different clans were deliberately mixed together, bound by loyalty to the Khan, not to their family. In one stroke, Temujin began to eliminate the tribal rivalries that had for centuries kept the Mongols divided. He also introduced a strict code of law known as the Yasa, an evolving set of legal principles that emphasized discipline, loyalty, merit, and justice. The Yasa outlawed theft, adultery, false testimony, and cowardice in battle. It also guaranteed religious freedom, an unprecedented policy for the era, and protected envoys and merchants, laying the groundwork for a stable empire built on trade, diplomacy, and order. Though the Yasa was often delivered orally and adapted over time, it formed the legal and ethical backbone of Temujin's regime. Crucially, Temujin continued to promote men based on merit rather than blood. Figures like Subutai, a blacksmith's son who would become one of the greatest military minds in history, and Jeeb, a former enemy archer who wounded Temujin in battle but was spared and welcomed into his inner circle, exemplified this principle. Temujin's genius lay in transforming enemies into allies, outcasts into commanders, and fractured tribes into a singular nation. Over time, more and more tribes began to flock to his banner. The Urud, Mangkut, and Jalir clans among others pledged loyalty, drawn by Temujin's vision and the opportunities he offered. His personal charisma was undeniable, but it was his fairness, his ruthless, impartial fairness, that drew the admiration of his followers. When a trusted ally stole a white horse from a poor herder, Temujin ordered the thief punished despite their friendship. The message was clear: under Temujin's rule, the law reigned above all. With growing strength, he began to absorb or subdue other powerful groups. One by one, rival chieftains fell or pledged allegiance. His following was no longer a fringe rebellion, it was becoming a movement, a new political reality. In 1201, the steppe erupted once again into war as a coalition of rival tribes declared Jamukha the Gurkhan, a title meaning universal ruler, meant to evoke ancient prestige. It was an attempt to unite the old guard against the rising power of Temujin. But this time, the tables had turned. Temujin's forces were more experienced, better organized, and utterly loyal. The climactic confrontation came in 1201 at the Battle of the 13 Sides. Jamukha, despite his new title, was decisively defeated. This time, Temujin was not captured or scattered. He was the victor, and he chose mercy. Rather than repeat the horrors of Jamukha's previous executions, he spared most of his enemies. The move solidified his reputation not only as a warrior, but as a just ruler. Still, the rivalry would not end there. 2 years later, Jamukha was captured by Temujin's forces after being betrayed by his own men. When brought before Temujin, the former Anda acknowledged his defeat and reportedly refused to betray his own followers in exchange for his life. In a final act of grim mercy, Temujin had Jamukha executed without torture, a death reserved for nobles. Their bond, broken by politics and bloodshed, was finally sealed in death. Now, there were no rivals left. In 1206, on the banks of the Onan River, the great Mongol tribal assembly, known as the Kurultai, was convened. Chiefs, generals, shamans, and nobles from across the steppe gathered in recognition of Temujin's authority. There, in a ceremony rich with symbolism and tradition, he was bestowed with the title Chinggis Khan, universal ruler, of all Mongols. It was not merely a title. It was a transformation. The fractured tribes of the Mongol world had been forged into a single, disciplined nation. For the first time in history, the Mongols had a leader who commanded not just their loyalty but their unity. And for the rest of the world, from China to the Caspian Sea, from the Silk Roads to the Persian highlands, a storm was now gathering, a force that would soon sweep across continents with a speed and fury the world had never known. Chinggis Khan had forged a nation from dust and discord. Now, he would forge an empire from fire and steel. The conquest of the Jin, thunder in the east. When Chinggis Khan emerged as the undisputed leader of a unified Mongol nation in 1206, he stood at the helm of a people unlike any the world had seen before, toughened by centuries of hardship, bonded by law and loyalty, and tempered by the flames of civil war. Yet unification was not the end, it was merely the beginning. Now that he had forged his people into a singular force, the question loomed, where would the Mongols turn their gaze? The answer came swiftly, eastward. The Jin dynasty of northern China, ruled by the Jurchen people, had long dominated the steppes and plains of Manchuria and northern China. For decades, they had manipulated the Mongol tribes, playing them off against one another to maintain control. The Jin had grown rich from trade and tribute, their opulent cities teeming with silk, grain, and silver. But to the newly unified Mongols, the Jin were more than just overlords, they were a target. Strategically, Chinggis Khan understood that an empire must be fed, not just with meat and milk from the steppes, but with coin, grain, and goods from settled lands. He also recognized the threat that the Jin still posed. Their wealth funded powerful armies, and they controlled key trade routes. To let them remain was to invite future interference. So, in 1211, after years of preparation and intelligence gathering, Chinggis Khan led his army of over 90,000 warriors across the Gobi Desert and into Jin territory. It was not a raid. It was a storm. The campaign began with devastating speed. The Mongols moved like lightning, advancing hundreds of miles in days, overwhelming garrisons, laying waste to fortresses. Their cavalry, highly mobile and ruthlessly efficient, struck not only military targets but infrastructure and supply lines. They employed classic steppe tactics, feigned retreats, sudden encirclements, and coordinated multi-pronged assaults. The Jin, though numerous and heavily fortified, were stunned by the ferocity and speed of the Mongol advance. The Jin had long relied on their great walls to defend against northern nomads. But Chinggis Khan bypassed these traditional defenses, moving through mountain passes and exploiting weak points in the border. He understood terrain like a master chess player reads a board. His commanders, legendary figures such as Subutai and Jebe, executed their campaigns with a precision and ruthlessness that made Mongol warfare as much psychological as physical. In 1213, the Mongols split into multiple columns, launching a three-pronged invasion deeper into Jin territory. One army advanced into Shandong, another moved toward the heartland, and the third threatened Zhengdu, the imperial capital, modern-day Beijing. By attacking simultaneously on multiple fronts, the Mongols sowed confusion and fear, collapsing the Jin centralized defense network. Whole cities fell without a fight. Local warlords, realizing the might of the Mongols, surrendered rather than risk annihilation. But the Mongols were not merely destroyers, they were strategists. They often spared cities that surrendered without resistance, preserving infrastructure and co-opting local administrators. They allowed religious freedom, respected scholars, and even employed Chinese engineers and advisors to improve their siege techniques. One of the Mongols' key innovations during this campaign was the use of catapults and gunpowder weapons, acquired through Chinese artisans, to breach the formidable Jin fortifications. By 1215, the Mongols had besieged Zhengdu. The siege was brutal and prolonged. The city's defenders, knowing the fate that awaited them, fought with desperation. But they were ultimately outmatched. When Zhengdu fell, it marked a turning point in the war, and a terrifying precedent for future cities. The Mongols plundered its wealth, slaughtered or enslaved its population, and sent a message to all of China: resistance would be crushed without mercy. Despite these victories, the Jin dynasty did not collapse immediately. They retreated south, regrouping and attempting to fortify their remaining holdings. But their power had been broken. For the rest of the campaign, they remained on the defensive, bleeding territory and people to Mongol incursions. By now, even the distant southern Song dynasty, which had once been a rival to the Jin, began to consider the Mongols as potential allies, or threats. Meanwhile, Chinggis Khan did not linger. He left garrisons and appointed governors to oversee conquered regions, ensuring a degree of order and continuity. He did not seek to rule China outright, yet. But he had permanently shattered the Jin's dominance over the north. The conquest of the Jin served several purposes. Militarily, it provided the Mongols with advanced siege technologies and experienced engineers, tools that would prove invaluable in future campaigns. Economically, it opened up new sources of grain, textiles, and trade goods. Politically, it marked the Mongols as a legitimate power in East Asia, no longer just raiders from the steppe, but empire builders. More importantly, it revealed the blueprint of Mongol conquest: lightning strikes, strategic terror, meritocratic leadership, adaptability, and ruthless efficiency. This pattern would be repeated across the continents in the years to come, from Persia to Hungary, from the Caucasus to the gates of Vienna. But even as the war with the Jin simmered, another conflict was already brewing. One that would take the Mongols westward, into the vast Islamic world, and into a confrontation that would define the next stage of Chinggis Khan's legend. He had crushed the might of the East. Now, the Khwarezmian Empire would feel the wrath of the steppes. The Khwarezmian catastrophe, vengeance of the Khan. By the early 13th century, the Mongols had subdued the Jin in the east and cast their shadow over northern China. Yet Chinggis Khan was not content to rest on his conquests. His vision was no longer confined to the steppes or even to Asia, it was expanding rapidly, fueled by a sense of destiny and an insatiable hunger for knowledge, commerce, and control. He had become more than a Khan. He was now a force of history, a wind that reshaped continents. To the west of the Mongol domains lay the powerful Khwarezmian Empire, a sprawling realm that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Hindu Kush, encompassing parts of modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. It was ruled by Shah Allah ad-Din Muhammad II, a monarch proud of his achievements and unyielding in his sovereignty. His empire was a wealthy one, sitting astride the Silk Road and brimming with cities that pulsed with scholars, artisans, and merchants. Chinggis Khan saw the Khwarezmian state not as an enemy, but as an opportunity. His intention was not initially war. On the contrary, in 1218, he sent a large caravan, laden with silks, silver, and diplomatic overtures, to the city of Otrar, a major Khwarezmian trade hub. It was an offer of peace and commerce. Chinggis Khan, ever the pragmatist, wished to open formal trade and diplomatic relations. But in Otrar, paranoia and ambition conspired to seal the empire's doom. The governor, Inalchuk, suspected the caravan of being a front for espionage. Whether this was true remains uncertain. What is certain is that the entire caravan was seized. The merchants were imprisoned, their goods confiscated. Worse still, some were tortured and killed. Chinggis Khan, seeking to avoid war, took a diplomatic path. He sent 3 emissaries to the Shah, demanding justice for the slain merchants and the punishment of the governor. What happened next would ignite a fury unlike any the Islamic world had ever known. The Shah had the lead envoy executed and the others humiliated, one had his beard burned off in an open court. This was no mere insult. It was a declaration of contempt, a rejection of diplomacy, and a direct affront to the great Khan's honor. Chinggis Khan was enraged, but not impetuous. He did not lash out blindly. Instead, he prepared meticulously. For over a year, he mobilized an army of around 150,000 warriors, gathered intelligence, and studied the terrain and political fractures of the Khwarezmian realm. He knew the empire was vast but decentralized, plagued by poor coordination between its governors and an arrogant ruler at its helm. The perfect prey. In 1219, the storm broke. The Mongol invasion of Khwarezm was not a war. It was an obliteration. Chinggis Khan split his forces into multiple coordinated columns. Subutai and Jib, his most trusted generals, led lightning-fast assaults through the northeast. Other divisions targeted central cities along the Sir Darya River. No front was safe. The Mongols executed complex flanking maneuvers, crossed vast deserts previously thought impassable, and struck with surgical precision. City after city fell: Bokhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, and Merv, each more defenseless than the last, each soon consumed in fire and ash. In Bokhara, the Mongols did what they often did upon entering a major city: they gathered the populace in the main mosque. Chinggis Khan himself addressed the stunned citizens. "I am the punishment of God," he reportedly declared. "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The slaughter was unimaginable. Resistance was met with total annihilation. Men, women, and children were butchered en masse. In Merv, according to some accounts, over 700,000 people were killed, though the exact number is uncertain. The devastation was beyond dispute. Entire libraries, schools, and places of worship were reduced to rubble. The Mongols, who had once sought peaceful trade, now offered only fire and steel. The Shah fled eastward, pursued relentlessly by Mongol detachments. Broken in body and spirit, he eventually died on an island in the Caspian Sea in 1220, alone, unmourned, and utterly defeated. His empire, once mighty, had vanished in a matter of months. Yet even this was not enough. The Shah's son, Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, rallied what forces remained and attempted to resist the Mongols. He showed remarkable bravery, defeating a Mongol detachment at Parwan. But his victories were fleeting. Chinggis Khan personally pursued him across the Indus River in a dramatic chase, cornering him at the Battle of the Indus. Jalal ad-Din fought valiantly but was ultimately forced to leap into the river on horseback to escape. Chinggis Khan, watching from the cliffs, is said to have admired the young warrior's courage and let him flee. With the Khwarezmian state annihilated, the Mongols did not settle. They left behind a wasteland, cities in ruins, economies shattered, cultures crushed. It was not merely conquest, it was a demonstration, a ruthless warning to the rest of the world: do not defy the Khan. But for all its horror, the campaign had a profound geopolitical effect. The Silk Road was cleared of bandits and fragmented fiefdoms. The Mongols imposed security and standardization, facilitating a level of transcontinental trade and communication unseen since the days of Rome and Han China. The Islamic world, reeling from the catastrophe, would never fully recover. Centuries-old centers of learning had been erased. The Mongol threat had become an existential one. And it was only just beginning. As the fires of Khwarezm smoldered, Chinggis Khan turned his attention elsewhere. His generals, now seasoned in siegecraft and desert warfare, began probing the outer edges of the world. The Caucasus. The steppe kingdoms of Russia. The eastern edges of Europe. And in the west, a new song would be sung. Not of survival, but of Mongol thunder crossing the mountains and rivers of foreign lands. Across the steppes, the thunder reaches Europe. With the annihilation of the Khwarezmian Empire, the Mongol war machine had proven itself not only as a tool of conquest, but as an unstoppable force of transformation. Empires collapsed before it, cities vanished, and borders evaporated in the face of their relentless advance. Yet Chinggis Khan, though victorious, was not finished. His generals, ever hungry for new horizons, now looked beyond the mountains and deserts of Central Asia, toward the uncharted west. In 1220, Chinggis Khan dispatched a reconnaissance in force, a probing expedition led by two of his most brilliant commanders, Subutai and Jebe. These two were not mere generals, they were instruments of annihilation and genius, masters of mobility, deception, and calculated fury. Their mission: to chart the unknown lands west of the Caspian Sea, test the strength of its rulers, and return with knowledge of the world that lay beyond. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary military operations in history. Subutai and Jebe led a force of about 20,000 elite Mongol cavalrymen, not a full invasion army, but a hardened spearhead. Over the course of 3 years, from 1220 to 1223, they embarked on a sweeping arc across the Caucasus, penetrating regions that had never seen the likes of Mongol warriors. They began by crossing into northern Iran, then veered northwest through the treacherous Caucasus Mountains, where they encountered the fierce Georgian kingdom and a coalition of Alans and Circassians. Though heavily outnumbered, the Mongols used cunning diplomacy and divide-and-conquer tactics, convincing one group to betray the others. When resistance broke, they crushed their enemies with swiftness, leaving the highlands littered with the dead. The Mongols then emerged into the vast Pontic Caspian steppe, home to the Kipchaks, a Turkic nomadic people, and other steppe tribes. Some tried to ally with the Mongols. Others resisted and were swiftly crushed. But it was not the steppe tribes that would prove the greatest test, it was the armies of Kievan Rus. In 1223, a coalition of Russian principalities, along with the Kipchaks, formed a massive army to halt the Mongol advance. Commanded by princes from Kiev, Galicia, and Smolensk, the Slavic force numbered over 80,000 men, including heavily armored cavalry, archers, and infantry. Confident in their strength, they marched to intercept the Mongols near the Kalka River. What they did not understand was that they were playing into a trap set by Subutai and Jebe. The Mongols executed a feigned retreat over several days, drawing the overconfident Russian Kipchak force deep into the steppe. Once stretched thin and isolated, the Mongols turned and struck with horrifying speed and coordination. The Battle of the Kalka River, fought in 1223, ended in complete disaster for the Rus. The coalition army was annihilated. The Mongols captured several princes and, in an act of psychological warfare, executed them by crushing them beneath wooden planks, a demonstration that Mongol justice was absolute and merciless. But then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, Subutai and Jebe vanished. Their mission complete, they rode back east, reporting everything they had seen and learned, the geography, the strength of cities, the temperament of princes, the weaknesses of armies. Their reconnaissance had covered thousands of miles, included dozens of skirmishes, and had left a string of ruined settlements in their wake. It was not an invasion, it was a message. The Mongols had found the West, and they would return. And they would. A decade later, that thunder would come crashing down on the plains of Eastern Europe, but that tale belonged to another chapter. Back in the east, Chinggis Khan had begun to feel the weight of time. His empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. He had built the greatest contiguous land empire the world had ever known, and yet he knew the Mongol project would not end with him. His final years were spent consolidating rule, installing administrators, preparing his sons, and leading a final campaign against the Tanguts of Western Xia, a kingdom that had defied him. It was during this campaign, in 1227, that Chinggis Khan died. The exact cause remains unknown. Some say he fell from his horse, others claim illness or injury in battle. His death was kept secret for months to ensure a smooth transition of power. Chinggis Khan was buried in an unmarked grave, its location a closely guarded secret, said to lie somewhere in the Khentai Mountains of Mongolia. Legend claims that all witnesses to his funeral procession were killed to preserve the sanctity of his final resting place. Whether true or not, it is fitting. The man who had thundered across continents left no mausoleum, no towering monument, only an empire and a legacy that would echo through the centuries. Yet this was no end. The empire did not fragment with his passing. Instead, it grew. Under the leadership of his sons and grandsons, the Mongol Empire would erupt across the known world, rushing into Persia, crushing Baghdad, razing Hungary, and standing at the gates of Vienna. Chinggis Khan had lit the flame. Now, his descendants would carry the torch into every corner of the earth. The world had entered a new epoch. An age of Mongol dominion, where kingdoms would fall like leaves, and the great Khan's vision would stretch from the Yellow Sea to the Danube. Ogdi and the invasion of Europe, the storm unleashed. Following the death of Chinggis Khan in 1227, the Mongol Empire faced a critical juncture. The founder's passing threatened instability, but the empire's intricate system of governance and the loyalty of its warriors held firm. Leadership passed to his third son, Ogdi Khan, a ruler of vision, discipline, and formidable organizational skill. Ogdi inherited not just an empire, but a military machine primed for conquest. He understood that the momentum must continue, that the sprawling domains and the Mongol way of war must be consolidated, expanded, and transformed into a lasting imperial structure. Unlike his father, whose reign had been characterized by constant campaigning and personal leadership on the battlefield, Ogdi was a pragmatic ruler who delegated extensively and focused on administration. One of Ogdi's first priorities was to complete the subjugation of the Western Xia and Jin dynasty in China, securing the empire's eastern flank. His armies completed the conquest of the Jin by 1234 and crushed Western Xia shortly thereafter. But Ogdi's ambitions did not end there. With his realm stabilized and resources secured, Ogdi turned his gaze westward once again, this time to Europe, the ultimate prize for the Mongol war machine. In 1236, Ogdi commissioned a massive invasion force under the command of two of the empire's most accomplished generals, Subutai, the master strategist, and Batu Khan, grandson of Chinggis and leader of the newly established Golden Horde in the western steppes. This invasion force was enormous, perhaps numbering up to 150,000 cavalry warriors, a combination of Mongols, Turkic auxiliaries, and conquered tribes. The campaign was meticulously planned. Multiple armies would advance through the Caucasus, cross the Volga River, and descend upon the principalities of Kievan Rus, while other detachments would push further west into Hungary and Poland. The Mongols moved like a living storm, swift and relentless. In 1237, the campaign began with a brutal assault on the fragmented Russian principalities. Cities such as Ryazan, Vladimir, and Moscow were razed to the ground. The defenders were overwhelmed by the Mongol superior tactics, encirclements, feigned retreats, and coordinated cavalry charges that shattered armies before they could properly form. By early 1240, the Mongols had sacked Kiev, the heart of Rus, a devastating blow that crushed Russian political power for decades. The fall of Kiev was marked by unimaginable slaughter and destruction. Churches were burned, palaces razed, and thousands killed or enslaved. But the Mongol advance did not halt at the borders of Russia. In 1241, the storm swept into Central Europe. Two Mongol armies invaded the Kingdom of Hungary and the Duchy of Poland. Their approach was methodical and brutal. The Mongols adapted their siege tactics to European stone castles, utilizing captured engineers and gunpowder weapons. Towns and villages were destroyed, and populations decimated. At the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, the Mongols employed their hallmark tactics. They lured the Hungarian forces into a trap, used artillery and coordinated cavalry assaults, and defeated the kingdom's army decisively. The aftermath was a landscape of ruin, famine, and terror. In Poland, battles such as the Battle of Legnica saw Mongol forces crush a coalition of European knights and nobles. Although some European forces showed bravery and resilience, the Mongols' speed and coordination overwhelmed them. The psychological impact of these campaigns was immense. The idea that the Mongols, nomads from the steppe, could defeat heavily armored knights and siege European fortresses seemed almost supernatural. Rumors spread like wildfire. The Mongols were invincible, aided by dark magic or divine wrath. Yet, the invasion of Europe abruptly halted in 1242. The reason was not defeat or lack of military success, but the death of Ogdi Khan back in Mongolia. Batu Khan, leading the Western forces, withdrew to participate in the Kurultai, the Mongol council to elect the new Great Khan. This pause spared much of Europe from further devastation and allowed kingdoms to recover and reorganize. However, the Mongol invasion had irrevocably altered the European political landscape. The fragmented principalities of Rus were transformed into vassals of the Golden Horde, paying tribute for centuries. The power vacuum in Eastern Europe shifted the balance among kingdoms, reshaping alliances and future conflicts. Moreover, the Mongol Empire established control over vast trade routes connecting east and west. The famed Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, would facilitate an unprecedented flow of goods, ideas, and technologies across Eurasia. Ogedi's reign thus marked a turning point, not just in conquest, but in world history. The Mongols had moved beyond their origins as steppe raiders to become rulers of a global empire influencing the fates of Europe, Asia, and beyond. The Golden Horde and the Mongol rule over Russia, the Long Shadow. After the Mongol armies withdrew from Europe in 1242, the vast western portion of the Mongol Empire was left under the control of Baghdad Khan, who established what would come to be known as the Golden Horde, a powerful khanate ruling over the steppes and the lands of the Rus principalities. The Golden Horde was more than just a military occupation. It was a political and economic system that would dominate Eastern Europe and parts of Central Asia for nearly 3 centuries. The Mongol rulers imposed their own administrative framework while allowing local rulers to remain in place, but only as vassals who paid tribute and obeyed the horde's demands. The principalities of Rus, fragmented and weakened from internecine warfare, found themselves under the Mongols' yoke. Russian princes were forced to journey to the horde's capital to receive yarliks, or official patents to rule, ensuring their loyalty. Failure to comply could lead to devastating reprisals. Though harsh, Mongol rule was pragmatic. The horde depended on tribute and trade rather than outright colonization. They maintained peace within their territories, the Pax Mongolica, which allowed merchants and travelers to move relatively freely across the vast expanse of Eurasia. This period profoundly shaped Russian development, political centralization. The Mongol system inadvertently fostered the rise of Moscow, which became the favored city for collecting tribute and representing Russian interests to the horde. Over time, Moscow grew from a minor principality to the dominant Russian power. Military innovation. The Russians adopted Mongol military tactics and organization, incorporating cavalry mobility and administrative methods that would influence their future campaigns. Cultural exchange. Despite the devastation, the Mongol period brought exposure to Central Asian and Islamic cultures, enriching Russian art, administration, and even technology. Yet Mongol domination also brought hardship. Cities were sacked, populations declined, and economic burdens of tribute were heavy. The memory of the Mongol yoke became a defining element of Russian identity, at times a source of humiliation, at others a rallying call for independence. Meanwhile, other khanates emerged from the Mongol Empire's fragmentation: the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Kublai Khan. The once unified empire began to splinter, but its influence on Eurasian geopolitics, trade, and culture was irreversible. The Golden Horde continued to influence Russian politics and society well into the 15th century, when the Grand Duchy of Moscow under Ivan III finally rejected Mongol overlordship, marking the end of the Tatar yoke and the rise of the Tsardom of Russia. The Yuan dynasty and Mongol rule in China, Empire of the Great Khan. While the Western campaigns expanded Mongol control over Europe and Russia, a different drama was unfolding in the East. One that would bring the Mongols face to face with the world's most ancient and bureaucratically sophisticated civilization, China. Chinggis Khan had begun the conquest of China during his lifetime, toppling the Western Xia and devastating the Jin dynasty. However, the rich, populous heart of southern China, ruled by the Song dynasty, remained beyond Mongol reach. It would be Chinggis's grandson, Kublai Khan, who would finally bring all of China under Mongol control. And in doing so, create one of the most powerful and unique empires in Chinese history, the Yuan dynasty. Kublai Khan, born in 1215, was unlike many of his Mongol kin. While a formidable military leader, he was also a scholar and statesman, deeply curious about Chinese culture, Confucian administration, and Buddhist philosophy. After consolidating his power and overcoming rivals, including his brother Eric Bok in a violent civil war for the title of Great Khan, Kublai turned his attention to conquering the southern Song. The Mongol campaign against the Song was long and arduous. Southern China's terrain was far more difficult than the open steppes, full of rivers, forests, and fortified cities. The Song were also no weak prey. They fielded large armies, possessed advanced technology, and had a well-organized bureaucracy. But Kublai's persistence and adaptability paid off. He employed Chinese engineers, built powerful siege engines, and even created a Mongol navy to attack the Song from the rivers and coasts, an unprecedented move for a traditionally land-based people. After decades of warfare, the Mongols captured the Song capital of Hangzhou in 1276, and by 1279, the last resistance was crushed. The southern Song dynasty was no more. With all of China under his control, Kublai proclaimed himself emperor and established the Yuan dynasty in 1271. This marked the first time in history that the entire Chinese empire was ruled by a foreign power. Yet Kublai's reign was not simply a continuation of Mongol conquest, it was a transformation. He moved the imperial capital to Khanbaliq, present-day Beijing, and began building a hybrid court that combined Mongol customs with Chinese governance. He preserved many elements of the Chinese administrative system, retained Confucian scholars, and issued edicts in multiple languages, including Chinese, Mongolian, Persian, and Tibetan. However, the Yuan dynasty also institutionalized ethnic hierarchy. At the top were Mongols, followed by non-Han groups such as Central Asians and Muslims, then Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese at the bottom. This created tensions and resentment, particularly among the native population. Economically, Kublai promoted agriculture, trade, and infrastructure. He revived the Grand Canal, introduced paper currency on a massive scale, and encouraged the famed Silk Road trade routes, which flourished under Mongol protection. The Yuan court became a cosmopolitan hub, visited by traders, scholars, and adventurers from across Eurasia, including the Venetian traveler Marco Polo, whose accounts would astonish Europe with tales of Mongol splendor and the wealth of China. Despite these achievements, the Yuan dynasty faced internal challenges. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy, inflation plagued the economy due to over-reliance on paper money, and natural disasters, including floods, droughts, and famines, undermined confidence in Mongol rule. Moreover, the divide between Mongols and Chinese remained a persistent source of friction. After Kublai's death in 1294, his successors lacked his vision and strength. The Yuan dynasty entered a period of decline, marked by court intrigues, rebellion, and military defeats. By the mid-14th century, widespread revolts erupted across China, culminating in the Red Turban Rebellion and the rise of a new native dynasty, the Ming. In 1368, the Yuan capital of Khanbaliq was captured, and the Mongols were driven back into the steppe. The Yuan dynasty ended, but its legacy endured. It was a remarkable experiment in empire. A fusion of Mongol and Chinese worlds, an era of cross-cultural contact and imperial ambition. The Yuan showed the heights the Mongol Empire could reach not merely through conquest, but through governance, culture, and innovation. The Ilkhanate and the Mongol transformation of the Islamic world. As the Mongol whirlwind swept across Eurasia, it finally collided with the ancient heartlands of Islam. A civilization that had for centuries flourished in cities like Baghdad, Nishapur, and Damascus. The man at the center of this transformative moment was Hulagu Khan, grandson of Chinggis Khan and brother to both Kublai Khan and the Great Khan monk. Entrusted with one of the largest and most consequential campaigns in Mongol history, Hulagu was dispatched to bring the Muslim West to heel, eliminate any powers that defied Mongol supremacy, and carve out a dominion of his own. His campaign was both brutal and decisive. He first moved against the Nizari Ismailis, a powerful and secretive sect entrenched in impregnable mountain fortresses across Persia. With methodical precision, Hulagu dismantled their strongholds one by one, culminating in the capture of their legendary citadel at Alamut. But the true centerpiece of his mission lay further west, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, a city that had long been the symbolic and spiritual heart of the Islamic world. In 1258, Hulagu's forces laid siege to Baghdad. Despite warnings and offers of negotiation, the caliph refused to surrender. The Mongols responded with unrelenting fury. Over the course of a few short weeks, Baghdad, once a beacon of knowledge, wealth, and culture, was reduced to smoldering ruin. The libraries, including the famed House of Wisdom, were looted and burned, their scrolls and manuscripts tossed into the Tigris River. Legend holds that the river ran black with ink and red with blood. Tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, were massacred. The caliph himself was executed in a manner designed to reflect both Mongol custom and brutal finality, rolled in a carpet and trampled to death, symbolizing the end of the Abbasid Caliphate and the subjugation of Islamic power to Mongol rule. From the ashes of the Islamic Golden Age, Hulagu established the Ilkhanate. His own Mongol-ruled Khanate, with its capital first at Moraga and later moved to the more strategically positioned Tabriz. It encompassed much of modern-day Iran, Iraq, and parts of the Caucasus and Anatolia. Though initially governed by foreign rulers with Buddhist or shamanist beliefs, the Ilkhanate rapidly became a crucible of cultural synthesis. The Mongols, pragmatic by nature, adopted and adapted the administrative systems of the Persians. They enlisted local bureaucrats and advisors, governed through a combination of Mongol martial authority and inherited Persian sophistication, and facilitated vibrant trade and communication across their lands. Yet the Ilkhanate's transformation from conquerors to rulers reached a dramatic turning point at the close of the 13th century. In a moment that astonished many observers, Ghazan Khan, one of Hulagu's successors, converted to Islam. His conversion was not merely a personal act of faith but a state policy that shifted the Khanate's ideological compass. Ghazan declared Islam the official religion of the Ilkhanate, aligning the Mongol court with the faith of the vast majority of its subjects. It was a watershed moment. The Mongols, once seen as the destroyers of the Islamic world, were now its protectors and participants. Under Ghazan's reign, sweeping reforms were introduced. He reorganized the fiscal system, rooted out corruption, codified laws, and sought to stabilize the economy, which had been strained by years of warfare and mismanagement. His vision was further expanded by his successor Al-Jitu, who continued to promote Islamic governance while fostering a court renowned for its patronage of scholars, artists, and architects. Persian culture experienced a rebirth under the Mongol Ilkhans, enriched by influences from China and Central Asia. Great historical works were written, such as Rashid al-Din's monumental Compendium of Chronicles, which sought to document not just the Mongol past but the interconnected histories of the world's major civilizations. Despite these achievements, the Ilkhanate's position was never entirely secure. To the southwest, the powerful Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt remained a constant rival. The two powers clashed repeatedly, and it was at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 that the Mongols suffered their first major defeat at the hands of a Muslim army, a turning point that checked their expansion into the Levant. Internally, the Ilkhanate suffered from dynastic struggles, local revolts, and the same centrifugal forces that afflicted the wider Mongol Empire. By the mid-14th century, it began to fragment. After the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335, without a strong heir to unify the realm, the Ilkhanate splintered into several smaller states, each vying for power amid growing disorder. Even in decline, however, the Ilkhanate left a profound legacy. It had facilitated the exchange of ideas, goods, and people across continents. It had helped lay the groundwork for the emergence of new Persian Islamic states. And perhaps most remarkably, it had transformed the Mongols. From agents of apocalyptic destruction to builders of a vibrant, if short-lived, Islamic polity. The blood that had once soaked the streets of Baghdad had given way to calligraphy, architecture, and a flowering of Persian culture that would echo for centuries. The Chagatai Khanate, struggles in the heart of Asia. The Chagatai Khanate, named after Chinggis Khan's second son, Chagatai, occupied a vast expanse of Central Asia stretching from the Amu Darya in the west to the Altai Mountains in the east. It was a land of deserts, steppes, and highlands, crisscrossed by ancient trade routes and inhabited by a patchwork of Turkic, Iranian, and Mongol peoples. Unlike the Ilkhanate or the Yuan dynasty, which rapidly developed settled bureaucracies and urbanized elites, the Chagatai Khanate remained much closer to its nomadic roots. This deep connection to the steppe, both a strength and a weakness, shaped its destiny in complex and often tumultuous ways. After Chinggis Khan's death, the territory was granted to Chagatai, who governed with loyalty to his father's laws and customs. He upheld the yasa, the strict code of Mongol conduct, and maintained the military traditions of his lineage. Upon his death, however, the Khanate passed not to a single powerful heir, but into the hands of a ruling house that would spend the next century struggling to balance Mongol traditions with the increasingly diverse and settled nature of the region. The heart of the Khanate included cities like Bokhara, Samarkand, and Kashgar, centers of trade and Islamic learning. Yet its ruling elites often remained aloof from these urban influences, preferring the life of the open steppe. This tension between nomadic and sedentary worlds became one of the defining dynamics of the Chagatai Khanate. Unlike the Ilkhanate, where conversion to Islam brought integration and cultural fusion, the Chagatai rulers were slower to adopt Islam. Many remained shamanist or Buddhist well into the 14th century, even as the majority of their subjects practiced Islam. This religious divide only deepened existing social and political fractures. Nomadic traditions resisted centralized authority, and the Khans found it difficult to enforce their will over powerful tribal leaders and city administrators. Internal strife was frequent, and succession disputes erupted with destabilizing regularity. Despite these challenges, the Chagatai Khanate managed moments of remarkable resilience and regional influence. Trade continued to flourish along the Silk Road, with caravans moving between China and the Islamic world, guarded by Mongol patrols and protected by customary laws. Cities under Chagatai influence became hubs of exchange where ideas, languages, and commodities blended. Yet these successes were often fragile, dependent on the strength of individual rulers rather than a coherent state structure. By the early 14th century, the Khanate had effectively split into two zones. The western region, centered around Transoxiana with cities like Samarkand and Balkh, and the eastern region, known as Mogulistan, comprising the more mountainous and nomadic parts of modern-day Kyrgyzstan, eastern Kazakhstan, and western China. This division, while informal at first, eventually hardened into a permanent political bifurcation. The western part of the Khanate saw increasing Persian and Islamic influence. Many of its cities became centers of religious scholarship and Sufi mysticism, gradually drawing the Mongol elites into the Islamic fold. In contrast, the eastern zone remained more staunchly Mongol and nomadic, retaining the spiritual and cultural ethos of Chinggis Khan's original world. These two spheres developed divergent political cultures, often clashing over questions of succession, religion, and control. The later rulers of the western Chagatai Khanate, such as Tarmashiran Khan, attempted to implement reforms that mirrored those of the Ilkhanate and Yuan, including conversion to Islam and efforts to centralize authority. But these efforts met with fierce resistance from traditionalist factions who viewed them as betrayals of the old Mongol ways. Tarmashiran's own conversion to Islam and his attempt to establish Islamic governance sparked a backlash that led to his downfall, illustrating the volatility of a realm caught between worlds. As the Khanate weakened, powerful warlords and tribal leaders began asserting independence. One of the most consequential of these was a man born not to the house of Chinggis, but to a lesser Mongol lineage, Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane. Rising from the ruins of the fractured western Chagatai Khanate, Timur would forge a new empire in Central Asia that would eclipse the authority of the Chagatai Khans themselves and inaugurate a bloody new chapter in the region's history. By the mid-14th century, the Chagatai Khanate had become a shadow of its former self. In the east, Mogulistan continued as a nominal Mongol polity but became increasingly isolated and tribal. In the west, power shifted to regional strongmen like Timur, who paid lip service to the old Khans while carving out autonomous realms. The once unified land of Chagatai had fragmented beyond repair, and the Mongol legacy in Central Asia passed into the hands of new actors with new ambitions. Yet the influence of the Chagatai Khanate endured in unexpected ways. It preserved Mongol identity longer than most other khanates, maintaining linguistic and genealogical continuity even amid political chaos. Its territory served as the cradle for Timur's future conquests and as a cultural bridge between China, India, and the Middle East. It also embodied the fundamental paradox of Mongol rule, the tension between steppe and city, tradition and transformation, conquest and accommodation. In this crucible of contradiction, the Chagatai Khanate shaped the destiny of Central Asia long after its own decline. The Yuan dynasty, Mongol rule over China and the birth of a new empire. When Kublai Khan set his sights on China, he was not merely leading a conquest, he was initiating a civilizational merger of unprecedented scale. As the grandson of Chinggis Khan and one of the most astute minds among the Mongol elite, Kublai understood that ruling China would require more than military might. He would have to master the intricacies of Chinese governance, win the loyalty of the Confucian bureaucracy, and present himself not as a foreign usurper, but as the legitimate son of heaven, a true emperor in the eyes of the Chinese people. His journey toward this vision began with a relentless military campaign against the remnants of the southern Song dynasty. While his predecessors had conquered the northern Jin and western Xia states, southern China remained fiercely independent and deeply entrenched. The Song dynasty had built a prosperous and culturally advanced state with formidable military defenses, especially along the Yangtze River. But the Mongols, through a mix of military innovation and strategic alliance building, gradually wore them down. Kublai used Chinese defectors and engineers, adopted siege technologies, and developed naval forces, an unusual move for a nomadic people. In 1276, the Song capital at Linnan, modern Hangzhou, fell, and by 1279, the last Song loyalists were defeated in a dramatic naval battle near modern Guangdong. With this, Kublai completed the unification of China under Mongol rule. But Kublai Khan did not rule merely as a Mongol Khagan, he proclaimed a new Chinese dynasty, the Yuan, in 1271, signaling his intention to govern as a legitimate Chinese emperor. This was no symbolic gesture. He adopted Chinese court rituals, wore Chinese imperial robes, and moved the capital from Karakoram on the Mongolian steppe to Dadu, a newly built city on the site of modern-day Beijing. The city would become a symbol of the new order. A capital that fused Mongol pragmatism with Chinese grandeur. The Yuan dynasty marked a seismic shift in both Chinese and Mongol history. Never before had China been ruled by a foreign dynasty that sought so directly to incorporate itself into the traditions of the land. The Mongol rulers retained their own identity and privileged position, but they built a government heavily reliant on Chinese administrative models. They divided society into a rigid caste system. At the top were the Mongols, followed by non-Chinese foreigners, often Central Asians and Muslims, then the northern Chinese, and at the bottom, the southern Chinese, who had resisted Mongol rule the longest. This hierarchy bred resentment, but it also reflected a calculated political reality. Kublai relied heavily on foreigners in key posts because he did not entirely trust the Chinese bureaucracy, which he viewed as potentially subversive. His court became a cosmopolitan hub, filled with Persian astronomers, Muslim mathematicians, Indian doctors, and even European visitors like the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, whose accounts of the Yuan court would captivate Europe for generations. Under Kublai's rule, China experienced both cultural renaissance and administrative innovation. The economy flourished, thanks to the revival and expansion of trade routes, including the fabled Silk Road, which now stretched in safety from Beijing to Baghdad. Paper money, first invented under the Song, became more widespread under the Yuan, facilitating commerce on an unprecedented scale. The Mongols invested in infrastructure, repairing and expanding the Grand Canal, improving roads, and building an efficient postal system that linked the empire's vast domains. Religious tolerance was another hallmark of the Yuan era. Though Kublai himself favored Tibetan Buddhism, his court supported a diversity of faiths: Confucianism, Taoism, Islam, Nestorian Christianity, and traditional Mongol shamanism all found a place under the imperial umbrella. This tolerance was not just a matter of ideology, it was a pragmatic approach to governing a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. Yet despite these successes, the Yuan dynasty was not without deep structural weaknesses. The Mongol elite, though now ruling from Chinese palaces, never fully assimilated into the cultural and bureaucratic traditions of China. Their preference for Mongol customs and their separation from the local populace bred cultural alienation. The rigid caste system fueled social division, while heavy taxation and forced labor provoked widespread unrest among the peasantry. Corruption spread throughout the bureaucracy, and factionalism plagued the imperial court, especially after Kublai's death in 1294. As the 14th century progressed, the dynasty became increasingly unstable. A series of weak successors failed to command loyalty or implement reform. Natural disasters, including floods and famines, exacerbated suffering in the countryside. Meanwhile, banditry and rebellion became common, and local warlords began to assert their independence. The most famous of these uprisings was the Red Turban Rebellion, a peasant movement infused with religious zeal and anti-Mongol sentiment. By the 1360s, the Yuan government could no longer contain the growing tide of unrest. In 1368, the rebel leader Zhu Yuanzhang captured Dadu and declared the founding of the Ming dynasty. The Mongol court fled northward, retreating to their ancestral homelands in the steppe. Though the Yuan dynasty was extinguished in China, the Mongols continued to rule in the north as the so-called Northern Yuan, a remnant that clung to imperial claims but never regained its former glory. Even in defeat, the Yuan legacy endured. It had opened China more fully to the outside world, embedding it in a Eurasian system of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. It had tested the limits of empire, showing how nomadic conquerors could embrace the trappings of civilization, yet struggle to sustain them. And it had left behind a city, Beijing, that would become the enduring heart of Chinese power for centuries to come. The Mongol Golden Horde, conquest and conversion on the Russian steppes. The origins of the Golden Horde trace back to one of Chinggis Khan's most formidable generals and grandsons, Batu Khan. As the son of Jochi, Chinggis Khan's eldest son, Batu inherited the westernmost lands of the Mongol Empire. In the early 1240s, he led a devastating campaign into Eastern Europe, sweeping across the Russian principalities and striking terror into the heart of Christendom. Cities such as Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev were razed with ruthless efficiency, their resistance shattered under the hooves of the Mongol cavalry. The Mongols' military brilliance, characterized by rapid movement, feigned retreats, and devastating coordination, overwhelmed even the most fortified Russian defenses. The Russian princes, fragmented and distrustful of one another, were unable to mount a unified resistance. Some fled, others were slaughtered. By 1240, Kiev, the spiritual and cultural cradle of Kievan Rus, had been reduced to ruins. The city's famed churches and monasteries were looted and burned, its population decimated. With this, Mongol dominance over the Russian lands was firmly established. Yet the Mongols did not choose to occupy Russia in the same manner as they did China or Persia. Instead, Batu Khan established his capital along the Volga River at a city called Sarai, where he could better oversee his dominions while remaining tied to the steppe. From this position, the Golden Horde ruled not through permanent garrisons or governors but through a sophisticated system of indirect rule. Russian princes were allowed to retain their thrones so long as they swore loyalty, paid tribute, and accepted the supremacy of the Khan. This arrangement proved remarkably durable. For more than 2 centuries, the Golden Horde exercised hegemony over the Russian principalities, extracting wealth while leaving much of local administration intact. Tribute collection became the primary symbol of Mongol authority in Russia. The princes, particularly those of Muscovy, were required to journey to the Khan's court with gifts and oaths of fealty. The Mongols issued yarliks, or charters, granting the right to rule to compliant Russian nobles. Those who defied Mongol demands were swiftly punished. But those who cooperated, especially the rising house of Moscow, found themselves increasingly favored, gradually becoming the agents of Mongol authority in the region. Religiously, the Mongols displayed the same tolerance that marked their rule elsewhere. The Russian Orthodox Church was left largely untouched and, in some ways, even benefited under Mongol suzerainty. Exempt from taxation and allowed to maintain its properties, the Church became a stabilizing force in a period of political subjugation. This allowed it to consolidate power and cultural authority, ensuring that Russian spiritual identity remained intact even as political sovereignty was lost. Over time, the Golden Horde itself evolved. It was not a static or monolithic entity. It adapted, changed, and absorbed influences from the lands it ruled. In the late 1200s and early 1300s, it began to undergo a significant religious transformation. Under the reign of Uzbek Khan, the Golden Horde officially adopted Islam as its state religion. This decision was both ideological and pragmatic. Islam offered a rich administrative tradition and allowed the Mongol rulers to align themselves with the powerful Muslim states to the south. The capital at Sarai became a vibrant center of Islamic culture, commerce, and architecture, drawing scholars, poets, and merchants from across the Islamic world. This conversion, however, added a new layer of complexity to Mongol-Russian relations. While the Mongols themselves had become Muslim, their Russian subjects remained staunchly Orthodox Christian. This religious divergence would add to the simmering tensions between overlords and subjects, especially as the Horde's authority began to wane. By the mid-14th century, the Golden Horde faced mounting internal pressures. Succession disputes, economic instability, and the ravages of the Black Death weakened central control. Regional governors became increasingly autonomous, and the once unified Khanate began to fracture into smaller, rival hordes. The most prominent of these were the White Horde, Blue Horde, and the Crimean Khanate, each vying for supremacy in the post-imperial landscape. At the same time, one of the Mongols' most loyal tributaries, Muscovy, began to rise in power. Through careful diplomacy, strategic marriages, and ruthless suppression of rivals, the Muscovite princes positioned themselves as the defenders of the Russian people and the legitimate successors to the legacy of Kievan Rus. By the late 1300s, a symbolic turning point arrived in the form of the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, where Prince Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow defeated the Mongol general Mamai. Though the Mongols would reassert their dominance soon after, the psychological impact of Kulikovo was immense. It proved that Mongol power could be challenged. Over the next century, Moscow continued to consolidate power and resist Mongol control. Finally, in 1480, the so-called Great Stand on the Yugra River marked the effective end of Mongol rule in Russia. Ivan III, Grand Prince of Moscow, refused to pay tribute, and when the Mongol army failed to advance, a standoff ensued. No battle was fought, but the Mongols retreated, and the symbolic yoke of the Golden Horde was broken. Yet even in defeat, the Mongols had left an indelible imprint on Russia. The centralized structure of Muscovite governance, the use of census and taxation systems, the postal routes, and even aspects of military organization bore the marks of Mongol influence. The very rise of Moscow, and its transformation into a powerful tsardom, was in many ways catalyzed by its relationship with the Horde. The Golden Horde had reshaped the Russian landscape. It had brought devastation, yes, but also trade, tolerance, and structure. It had imposed foreign rule, but in doing so, laid the foundation for a new Russian state. The Mongols had come as conquerors, but they left as architects of a profoundly altered Eastern Europe. Timur and the Reign of Terror, the last flame of Mongol ambition. The man known to history as Timur was born in 1336 near the city of Kesh, south of Samarkand in present-day Uzbekistan. Though he was a member of a Mongolized Turkic tribe and traced his lineage to the great conquerors of the steppe, Timur was not a descendant of Chinggis Khan himself. This posed a problem, for in the Mongol world, political legitimacy was deeply intertwined with Genghisid blood. Timur, ever the political strategist, solved this by ruling through puppet khans, figureheads descended from Chinggis, while he exercised true power as the military commander and sovereign. His rise began in a fractured Central Asia, a region still reeling from the collapse of the Chagatai Khanate, where rival warlords, tribal leaders, and decaying cities vied for control. Through cunning alliances, ruthless betrayals, and extraordinary military skill, Timur consolidated power in Transoxiana. By the 1370s, he had secured his position as the dominant force in the region, making Samarkand his capital, a city he would transform into one of the most dazzling cultural centers of the medieval Islamic world. Yet Timur was not content to be merely a regional power. Like Chinggis Khan before him, he saw the world as a stage for conquest. His campaigns would stretch from India to Anatolia, from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf. And though he invoked the memory of the Mongols and borrowed their military traditions, his wars were marked by an even more deliberate and theatrical cruelty. In 1381, he invaded Persia, a land still recovering from the earlier Mongol devastation. Timur ravaged cities that resisted him. In Isfahan, after a rebellion against his garrison, he ordered the massacre of up to 70,000 people, stacking their skulls in pyramids outside the gates. In Baghdad, the historic capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, he repeated this grim display, leaving tens of thousands dead. His message was clear: defiance would be met with total annihilation. Timur's military tactics echoed those of his Mongol forebears: light cavalry, feigned retreats, coordinated assaults, but he also employed psychological warfare with terrifying precision. Cities often surrendered before his arrival, hoping to avoid the fate of their neighbors. His army, disciplined and multi-ethnic, included Mongols, Turks, Persians, and even captured engineers and artisans. His logistics and strategic planning were impeccable, allowing him to strike with speed across vast territories. One of his most ambitious campaigns was the Indian expedition of 1398. At the time, the Delhi Sultanate was plagued by internal strife and disorganization. Timur crossed the Indus with a vast army and descended upon Delhi, where he met little meaningful resistance. What followed was a cataclysm. Delhi, one of the richest cities in the world, was subjected to looting, slaughter, and enslavement on a horrific scale. Timur's justification was religious. He claimed to be purging the Muslim world of heretical rulers, but his real motives were wealth, glory, and a statement of supremacy. When he left India, he carried back incalculable treasure and thousands of artisans to beautify Samarkand. His final and perhaps most legendary military engagement came in 1402, when he turned westward and confronted the Ottoman Empire. At the Battle of Ankara, Timur faced Sultan Bayezid I, nicknamed the Thunderbolt, for his speed in battle. In a stunning reversal of expectations, Timur's army decisively defeated the Ottomans, and Bayezid himself was captured. This was a monumental shock to the Islamic world. The rapidly rising Ottomans, who had threatened the Byzantine remnants and dominated the Balkans, were suddenly halted. Bayezid was paraded in a cage, and the Ottoman state plunged into a decade of civil war, delaying their conquest of Constantinople by half a century. Despite his brutality, Timur was not a mere destroyer. In his wake, he left behind not only ruin but also the cultural flowering of a new imperial court. Samarkand became a jewel of the Islamic world, adorned with mosques, madrasas, gardens, and mausoleums. Timur patronized scholars, artists, and architects, blending Persian, Turkic, and Mongol elements into a distinct Timurid aesthetic. His dynasty would later produce great minds like Ulugh Beg, his grandson, an astronomer and mathematician who built one of the finest observatories of the early modern world. But Timur himself remained ever the warrior. He planned yet another campaign late in life, this time against the Ming dynasty of China, hoping to reassert steppe dominance over the east. In 1405, as his massive army advanced, he fell ill and died in Otrar before the invasion could begin. His body was brought back to Samarkand, where he was buried in the magnificent Guriamir mausoleum. Timur's death marked the end of the last great nomadic empire forged in the mold of Chinggis Khan. Though his descendants would rule parts of Central Asia and Persia for another century, and the Timurid legacy would influence the later Mughal Empire in India, the age of mounted steppe conquerors was drawing to a close. Gunpowder, sedentary states, and the rising powers of Europe and the Middle East were beginning to eclipse the world Timur had dominated. His reign left a world haunted by violence, but also one lit by the brilliance of artistry and architecture. Timur was a paradox. A man who built by destroying, who admired scholars while drowning cities in blood, and who dreamed of empire even as he scattered civilizations to dust. His empire, short-lived but explosive, was the final roar of the Mongol age. The decline of the Mongol world, fractures, failures, and the legacy of an empire. By the early 15th century, the Mongol world was no longer a unified empire, but a constellation of successor states, each clinging to pieces of an evaporated inheritance. The Yuan dynasty in China had been overthrown in 1368 by the Ming. The Golden Horde fractured under the weight of internal strife and the rising power of Muscovy. The Ilkhanate had already collapsed in the 1330s, leaving behind a patchwork of Persianate dynasties, and the Chagatai Khanate had fragmented into rival factions. Timur's empire, the last burst of nomadic imperialism, dissolved almost as quickly as it had formed. One of the most symbolic milestones in the Mongol decline was the fall of the Yuan dynasty. When the Ming armies, fueled by anti-Mongol sentiment and led by Zhu Yuanzhang, the future Hongwu emperor, drove the Mongols out of Beijing, they brought an end to nearly a century of Mongol rule in China. The Yuan emperors retreated to the northern steppes and established what came to be called the Northern Yuan, a much-reduced polity that clung to the traditions of Chinggis Khan but held little influence outside the Mongol heartland. The Ming would erase many signs of Mongol rule, but they could not erase the deep administrative reforms and infrastructural innovations introduced during the Yuan. In Persia and Central Asia, the fall of the Ilkhanate left a power vacuum that was soon filled by regional dynasties, some of which traced their legitimacy to Mongol roots. The rise of the Safavids in Persia in the early 1500s marked a new chapter, blending Persian cultural renaissance with Sharia Islam, but also inheriting the administrative and military legacies of Mongol rule. In Central Asia, the Timurids continued to rule parts of the region into the 16th century, their empire a flickering flame in the shifting sands of history. The Golden Horde, once the terror of Russia and Eastern Europe, gradually lost coherence in the 15th century. The Khans increasingly became puppets of regional warlords, and splinter khanates such as the Crimean, Kazan, and Astrakhan khanates emerged. These successor states would persist for another century or two, often clashing with rising powers like Muscovy, Lithuania, and the Ottomans. In 1552, Ivan the Terrible, Tsar of Russia, captured Kazan, once a proud successor to the Golden Horde, symbolically ending Mongol dominance over Russian lands. Even in their decline, the Mongols had reshaped Eurasia. Trade routes, once dangerous and fragmented, had been welded into the Pax Mongolica. A transcontinental network of roads and safe passes that allowed goods, people, and ideas to flow from China to Europe. Though the unified Mongol system collapsed, the infrastructure and commercial relationships they had built endured. The Silk Road would never again see the level of integrated protection it enjoyed under Mongol rule, but its legacy lived on in the connections between East and West. In the realms of governance and military organization, the Mongol impact was profound. Many states adopted Mongol practices, from census-taking to postal relay systems. The Ottoman Devshirme system and even the Mughal administrative hierarchy bore traces of Mongol influence. Military tactics, particularly the use of cavalry, disciplined formations, and composite bows, became foundational models for the gunpowder empires that followed. Culturally, the Mongols were agents of synthesis. Their courts, especially in Persia and Central Asia, became melting pots of Mongol, Turkic, Persian, and Chinese elements. They commissioned scholars, tolerated multiple religions, and encouraged scientific exchange. The very idea of religious tolerance in a multi-ethnic empire, a rarity in the medieval world, was a Mongol innovation born of pragmatism and curiosity. Even language bears their imprint. Mongol terms seeped into Russian, Persian, and even Hungarian and Polish vocabulary. Administrative titles, court rituals, and diplomatic practices across Eurasia reveal a subtle but lasting Mongol inheritance. Yet despite their enormous impact, the Mongols left few monuments to themselves. Unlike the Egyptians with their pyramids, or the Romans with their aqueducts and roads, the Mongols built little in stone. Their memory survives not in colossal architecture but in movement, adaptation, and transmission. Their legacy is written in trade routes, political structures, and cultural diffusion. By the 16th century, the age of the nomadic conqueror was waning. The advent of gunpowder, the rise of fortified cities, and the centralization of state power began to outmatch the mobility and tactics of the steppe. The once mighty mounted archer gave way to the musket and cannon. The world was entering the age of maritime empires, bureaucratic nation-states, and industrial economies. Realms the Mongol model could not dominate. And yet, long after their political power had faded, the story of the Mongols continued to inspire awe, fear, and fascination. In the West, they remained a symbol of barbarian terror; in the East, a memory of imperial greatness. Modern Mongolia would eventually reclaim this heritage, fashioning a national identity centered around the legacy of Chinggis Khan, now a hero, a statesman, and a symbol of unity. The Mongol Empire. Sprawling, brutal, innovative, and transformative, was not simply a moment in history, but a bridge between worlds. It shattered old orders, built new paths, and left a mark on every region it touched. From the Pacific to the Danube, from the steppes of Mongolia to the deserts of the Middle East, the Mongols shaped the contours of history not only through conquest but through connection. They came with the winds of war, but in their wake, the seeds of a globalized world began to take root. The eternal echo, the Mongol Empire and the shaping of the world. When Chinggis Khan rose from the desolate grasslands of Mongolia, few could have predicted that he would alter the very architecture of civilization. The Mongol Empire began as the dream of a single man driven by revenge, ambition, and a deep belief in destiny. Yet it became the largest contiguous empire in world history, changing the course of countless cultures, dynasties, and traditions. Its power was not only in its armies, but in its ability to redraw the map of the known world, physically, intellectually, and spiritually. The Mongols are often remembered as destroyers. And indeed, the devastation they inflicted was without parallel. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years, Merv, Nishapur, Baghdad, were reduced to cinders and skulls. Entire populations were massacred or scattered. Centers of learning were torched, and rivers were choked with the remains of civilizations. But this destruction, horrifying as it was not senseless chaos. It was methodical, strategic, and often deliberately employed to instill fear and force surrender. The violence, though terrible, was part of a broader vision, one of unity, order, and domination across a world that had long been fragmented. And within that brutality, something remarkable was born. The Mongol world order, the Pax Mongolica, allowed for a level of interconnectedness never before achieved. Trade routes that had lain dormant for centuries came alive again. Silk, porcelain, spices, gems, and ideas flowed from China to Europe. Persian astronomers taught their craft in Beijing, Italian merchants such as Marco Polo reached the court of the Great Khan, Islamic scholars debated with Chinese monks in Central Asian caravansaries. The Mongols didn't just ride across continents, they stitched them together. Chinggis Khan's legal code, the Yasa, introduced a new kind of governance to the steppe, one rooted in merit, loyalty, and order rather than tribal privilege. His insistence on religious tolerance allowed Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and shamans to coexist and flourish within a single imperial framework. In a world torn by sectarian strife, the Mongol approach was radical. It was not born of modern liberalism, but of pragmatic statecraft, the need to govern a world of dizzying diversity. Still, the effects were profound. Many regions under Mongol rule experienced unprecedented cultural syncretism and freedom of belief. Perhaps most astonishing is the way the Mongols modernized warfare. They pioneered military intelligence, psychological operations, siegecraft, and logistics on a scale unseen in the medieval world. Their use of light cavalry, composite bows, signal flags, and battlefield mobility influenced armies from the Middle East to Japan. And even in their failure, such as the abortive invasions of Japan and Southeast Asia, they revealed the limits of imperial ambition and the unpredictable power of geography and weather. Yet the Mongol Empire was not built to last. Its speed of expansion was both its strength and its undoing. The very forces that created it, kinship loyalty, decentralized command, fierce independence, also fractured it. When Chinggis Khan died, his empire survived not as one monolithic state, but as a collection of khanates. For a while, these khanates coordinated, communicated, and even cooperated. But as generations passed and regional interests prevailed, unity gave way to rivalry. The universal empire gave way to local rule. Eventually, the storm abated, and the great horsemen of the steppes faded into the past. And yet, did they ever truly disappear? Look closely, and the Mongols remain with us. In the borders they redrew. In the cities they built or rebuilt, Beijing, Samarkand, Tabriz. In the administrative structures of later empires, the Ottomans, Mongols, Safavids, and even the early modern Russian state. In the tolerance they codified, the trade they accelerated, the idea of a world empire not defined by race or religion but by the will to power and governance. Their legacy rides not on horseback, but in the DNA of empires. Today, in the windswept plains of Mongolia, the memory of Chinggis Khan looms like a mountain. His name graces airports, vodka bottles, statues, currency, and hearts. He is no longer simply a conqueror, he is a national myth, a symbol of unity, resilience, and glory. And across the globe, scholars continue to debate, reevaluate, and rediscover the Mongol Empire, not as a footnote of destruction, but as a turning point in the human story. What, then, was the Mongol Empire? It was many things, a scourge and a salvation, a fire and a forge, a terror and a triumph. It was a lesson in the impermanence of power and the permanence of influence. It was the wild dream of a man born into nothing, who through strength and vision carved a path across the heavens. It was the sound of hooves upon the earth, echoing still. The world we live in, its borders, its cities, its faiths, its fears, is in part a world the Mongols made.